The permafrost doesn't forgive mistakes. Katrin Olavsdottir knows this the way other women know their children's faces. Intimately, without question, with the kind of certainty that comes from years of paying attention when attention is the only thing standing between survival and a frozen grave. She stands at the edge of her property on a September morning, when the air tastes like metal, and the sky holds that particular shade of gray that promises an early winter. Her breath comes out in clouds that hang in the stillness before dispersing. Around her, the Yukon landscape stretches in every direction, black spruce and white spruce crowding the valleys, their branches already heavy with frost. Beyond them, mountains rise like broken teeth against the horizon. Their peaks disappeared into clouds that have been there since August and won't lift until May. Her hands, bare despite the cold, rest on the wooden frame of what her neighbors call her folly, what they call her madness, what they'll call, in whispers that carry across the distance between homesteads, proof that losing her husband broke something essential inside her. The structure sits in a depression she spent 2 summers excavating. 12 feet deep, 40 feet long, 20 feet wide. The walls are reinforced with timbers she cut herself from a forest that crowds her property line. The floor is gravel over sand over clay, sloped toward a drainage system that took her 3 months to engineer correctly. And the roof is what makes them laugh. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story is touching you already, make sure you're subscribed. I've got something extra special saved for tomorrow. Glass. Salvaged windows from the old mining camp 15 miles north. Hauled on a sled, she pulled herself through snow that came up to her thighs. 23 windows in total. Fitted into a framework of lodgepole pine, angled to catch every possible photon of winter sun. The glass is old, wavy in places, cracked in others. But it's glass, and glass means light, and light means life when the temperature drops to 80 below and stays there for weeks. Her neighbors don't understand. They see a woman wasting time on something that can't possibly work. They see someone who should be stacking firewood and smoking meat and preparing for winter the way generations of northern homesteaders have prepared, by hunkering down, by enduring, by accepting that fresh food is a memory that dies in October and doesn't resurrect until June. They don't see what she sees. They don't understand what Magnus taught her before the ice took him. Katrin is 62 years old. Her hair, once the color of wheat, has gone white in the 5 years since Magnus died. Not gray, white. The kind of white that happens when grief moves through a body so completely that it changes the chemistry of everything it touches. Her face is lined deeply. The kind of weathering that comes from decades of squinting against snow, glare, and wind that feels like it's trying to peel your skin off in strips. She's not a large woman. 5'4", maybe 130 pounds when she remembers to eat regularly. But her shoulders are broad from years of splitting wood and hauling water, and her hands are strong in the way that hands become when they're the only tools you trust. There's a scar across her left palm from a knife that slipped while she was gutting a moose. Another scar, smaller, above her right eyebrow from a branch that snapped back while she was clearing trail. She doesn't think of herself as tough. She thinks of herself as still breathing, which is the only metric that matters in a place where the winter doesn't care about your feelings or your philosophy or your very reasonable objections to dying. The homestead sits at the end of a valley that dead ends into mountains too steep to cross except during a brief window in July and August. The nearest neighbor is 4 miles east, the Hendricksons, a family of 7 who think Katrin is wasting her time. Beyond them, another 6 miles to the Voiks, an older couple who used to be friendly until Magnus died and Katrin stopped attending the monthly community gatherings in the town of Whitestone. Population 47 in summer, 32 in winter, when the smart ones go south. Whitestone itself is 12 miles from Katrin's cabin if you follow the trail in good weather. 15 miles if the snow is deep and you have the brake trail. 20 miles if you're being honest about how long it actually takes when you're hauling supplies on a sled and the temperature is cold enough to freeze your lungs if you breathe too hard. The cabin Magnus built is solid. Logs chink with moss and mud. A sod roof that grows grass in summer and holds snow in winter for insulation. One room, 14 by 16 feet. with a loft where they used to sleep before Magnus died, and Katrin moved her bedroll to floor because climbing the ladder every night felt like too much effort for someone who didn't care where she woke up. There's a wood stove that Magnus welded together from sheet metal and an old fuel drum. It heats the cabin adequately, burns clean when the wood is dry, and has a flat top where Katrin can cook the soups and stews that constitute her diet from October to May. There's a table Magnus built from spruce, 2 chairs, a shelf for books that neither of them could read because they were both dyslexic, but kept anyway because having books felt important. The root cellar extends under the cabin's north wall, accessible through a trapdoor near the stove. It's deep enough to stay above freezing even when the temperature outside drops to -60. Magnus dug it their first year, understanding that without proper cold storage, they wouldn't survive their first winter. They survived 15 winters together. Then Magnus went through the ice on the river while checking his trapline in March. When the thaw comes early some years and the ice that looks solid isn't, the current took him under. They found his body 3 miles downstream in May when the breakup came. Katrin identified him by his boots because his face wasn't his face anymore. She buried him on the hillside above the cabin, where he used to sit in the evenings and watch the sun set behind the mountains. She didn't mark the grave with anything permanent. The permafrost would just heave whatever marker she placed, pushing it up and out of the ground to the freeze-thaw cycles until it fell over. Instead, she planted wild roses from the riverbank, the rugosa kind that survives anything, that blooms pink and fragrant in June and July before the frost kills the flowers, and the plant goes dormant until the next impossible spring. The roses are dormant now. The grave is just a slight rise in the hillside, covered with frost and the first dusting of snow. Katrin visits it every morning. She doesn't talk to Magnus there. She talks to him everywhere, in every room of the cabin, during every task they used to do together. The grave is just where she goes to be quiet, to remember that grief isn't something you get over. It's something you learn to carry differently. After Magnus died, people expected her to leave. The Hendricksons offered to help her pack. The Voigt suggested she sell the homestead, not that anyone would buy it, and move to Whitestone where there was a small apartment above the general store that sometimes rented to widows. Even the Territorial Land Office sent a letter asking if she planned to maintain her claim or if she'd be forfeiting the property due to inability to meet the residency requirements alone. Katrin burned the letter in her wood stove and kept working because Magnus had left her something. Not money. They never had money. Not a pension or insurance or any of the financial instruments that city people relied on. He left her knowledge, drawings in a journal he kept, sketches of a greenhouse system he'd learned about from a Norwegian engineer he'd met in Dawson City during the gold rush years, before Magnus came north, before he met Katrin, when he was still young and thought fortune was something you'd dig out of the ground. The Norwegian engineer had worked in Svalbard, that cluster of islands north of Norway where the sun doesn't rise for months and the temperature makes the Yukon look tropical. He designed greenhouse systems for mining camps there, underground structures that use geothermal heat and strategic insulation to grow vegetables year-round in conditions that should have made agriculture impossible. Magnus had copied the designs carefully, translated the Norwegian engineer's notes into English with help from a dictionary, added his own modifications based on Yukon conditions. He'd planned to build it their 16th winter. He'd already started the excavation the summer before he died. That first depression, 8 feet deep, before the project became too much to do alone, and he'd set aside to focus on more immediate survival needs. Katrin found the journal a month after his funeral. She read it by candlelight, studying the cross-sections and elevation drawings, the notes about thermal mass and solar angles, and the importance of southern exposure. She didn't understand all of it. Magnus had been the one with the education, the one who could read technical documents and translate them into action. But she understood enough. She understood that Magnus had been trying to solve a problem that killed people every winter in the north. Scurvy, malnutrition, the slow breakdown of the body when it goes months without fresh vegetables, when vitamin C becomes a memory and your gums start bleeding and your teeth loosen and your wounds stop healing. She understood that the greenhouse wasn't just about growing food. It was about proving that survival didn't have to mean barely surviving, that you could live in a place this hostile and still have lettuce in February, tomatoes in March, Carrots that tasted like something other than the woody. Tasteless roots you pull from cold storage in April after they've been sitting in sand since September. She understood that finishing what Magnus started was the only way she knew to keep him alive. So she dug. Section 2, the catalyst, inciting incident. The real digging started the summer after Magnus died, when the ground thawed enough to accept a shovel without breaking the handle. Katrin worked alone. Not because she wanted to, though there was something clarifying about solitary labor, something that made the grief manageable when it was transformed into sweat and aching muscles and tangible progress you could measure in cubic feet of excavated earth. She worked alone because no one offered to help. The neighbors who might have assisted decided, in the way communities do, that helping her would only encourage foolishness. Better to let her exhaust herself, come to her senses, accept reality. Reality, in their estimation, was that a 60-year-old widow had no business attempting a construction project that would challenge a team of young men. Reality was that greenhouses didn't work in the Yukon because the sun disappeared for too much of the winter and the cold was too extreme and the growing season was too short. Reality was that people had been trying to farm in the north for generations, and the ones who survived were the ones who accepted that fresh food was a luxury, not a right, and adjusted their expectations accordingly. Katrin's expectations were different. Magnus' design called for the greenhouse to be sunk 12 feet below grade, not 8 feet like his initial excavation, but 12, deep enough that the walls would be surrounded by earth that stayed at a relatively constant temperature year-round, buffered by the permafrost layer that began at 15 feet down and extended hundreds of feet into the ground. The earth itself would provide insulation, reducing heat loss through the walls and creating a stable thermal environment that required less energy input to maintain livable temperatures for plants. The excavation took all summer, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, interrupted only by rainstorms that turned the pit into a mud hole and required bailing before work could continue. Katrin moved approximately 40 tons of earth that first summer, one shovelful at a time, hauling it up a ramp she built from scrap lumber and spreading it around the perimeter to create berms that would redirect snow melt away from the structure. Her body adapted. The first week left her so she could barely move. She worked through it because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant falling into the hole Magnus' absence had created, and falling meant not climbing back out. By the second week, her muscles had remembered what it meant to work at this intensity. By the fourth week, she had developed calluses on top of calluses, her hands transformed into something more like tools and flesh. The neighbors drove past occasionally, usually on their way to or from Whitestone. They'd slow down, look at the growing pit, shake their heads, and continue on. No one stopped. No one asked if she needed help. No one tried to talk her out of it anymore, because it was clear she wasn't listening. But they talked about her in Whitestone. Katrin heard about it from Sarah Yates, the woman who ran the general store, and one of the few people who still treated Katrin like a human being rather than a cautionary tale. "They're calling it Olavsdottir's folly," Sarah said, one afternoon in July when Katrin came to town for supplies. "The men mostly. They're taking bets on how long before you give up." "What are the odds?" Katrin asked, counting out coins for 50 pounds of seed potatoes she didn't actually need, but bought anyway because Sarah needed the business and loyalty mattered more than money in places where both were scarce. 3 to 1 you quit before winter. 5 to 1 you make it through one winter before abandoning the project. 10 to 1 you actually finish it and it works. Who took the 10 to 1? No one yet, Sarah admitted. It's a sucker bet. Everyone knows greenhouses don't work up here. Katrin loaded the potatoes into her packed basket. Everyone knows a lot of things that aren't true. That's what Magnus used to say. Magnus was usually right. Sarah wrapped Katrin's change in a scrap of newsprint. "The Hendricksons are saying you've gone strange. That losing Magnus broke something in your head." "Maybe it did," Katrin said, "but broken things still work sometimes. They just work different than they used to." By August, the excavation was complete. 12 feet deep, 40 feet long, 20 feet wide. The walls sloped slightly inward to prevent cave-ins and provide structural stability. The floor was level within half an inch over the entire 40-foot length. Katrin had checked obsessively with the water level Magnus had made from glass tubing and rubber hose, understanding that proper drainage required precise grading. The timber reinforcement came next. Vertical posts every 4 feet along the walls, lodgepole pine 8 inches in diameter, sunk 2 feet into undisturbed earth below the floor level and extending to what would become the roof line. Horizontal planks between the posts, fitted tightly to prevent soil intrusion, while allowing for slight movement as the ground froze and thawed. The timber work took 3 weeks. Katrin felled the trees herself from a stand of lodgepole a mile from the cabin, sectioned them with a 2-man crosscut saw that she operated alone by anchoring one handle to a tree and pulling the other, dragged them to the site with a rope harness that left permanent grooves in her shoulders, and fitted them into place using a combination of brute force and mechanical advantage from a lever system Magnus had taught her to build. The Voig stopped by during the timber installation. Helmut Voigt, a German immigrant who'd been in the territory for 30 years, stood at the edge of the pit and studied the framework with the critical eye of someone who'd built enough structures to recognize quality workmanship when he saw it. "Your angles are good," he said finally. "The posts are plumb. You know what you're doing." Magnus knew, Katrin said. "I'm just following his drawings." Following them well. Helmut's wife, Greta, stood beside him, a small woman with intelligent eyes and hands that never stopped moving. She was knitting something. She was always knitting something, her fingers working automatically while her attention focused elsewhere. "It won't work, though," Greta said, not unkindly, stating a fact. "Glass can't hold heat when it's 80 below outside. The plants will freeze." "The plants will be 12 feet underground," Katrin said, "surrounded by earth. The glass is just to let light in. Light isn't enough. You need heat. The earth provides heat, geothermal. The temperature 15 feet, down stays constant year-round, around 40 degrees. I only need to raise it another 20 degrees inside the greenhouse to keep most vegetables alive through winter." Helmut frowned. "How will you raise at 20 degrees? "Thermal mass. Water barrels painted black to absorb solar heat during the day. Rock walls on the north side to hold heat. Composting systems that generate their own warmth. And insulation, foam panels on the walls, double-layer glass where I can manage it." "You've thought this through," Helmut said. "Magnus thought it through. I'm just building it." They left shortly after, Greta still shaking her head, Helmut looking thoughtful. As they drove away in their battered truck, Katrin heard Greta say something about stubborn and pride, and going to kill herself trying to prove something to a dead man. Maybe that was true. Katrin didn't particularly care. Proving something to Magnus, or for Magnus, or because of Magnus, the motivation didn't matter as much as the outcome. If the greenhouse worked, she'd have fresh food through the winter. If it failed, she'd have wasted a summer on a project that at least kept her too busy to dwell on the fact that she was alone. Either way, she'd know. The glass installation began in September, as the days shortened and the temperature started its long descent toward winter. Katrin had collected 23 windows from the abandoned mining camp at Creek, a settlement that had thrived briefly during a silver rush in the 1920s and died just as quickly when the ore ran out. The windows were intact. The buildings had been constructed well, built to last through winters that the miners assumed to be temporary, but that had outlasted their optimism. She hauled them on a sled, 3 at a time, making 8 trips total over the course of 2 weeks. Each trip was a full day's work. 15 miles there, 15 miles back, pulling a sled loaded with 100-pound windows through terrain that ranged from merely difficult to actively hostile. The trail followed a creek bed that had more rocks than water, crossed 2 ridges where the grade was steep enough that she had to rope the sled to trees to prevent it from running away on the descents, and passed through a stand of Devil's Club that left her arms covered in scratches that took weeks to heal. But she got the windows. All 23 of them. Not one broken. Though 2 had cracks she'd have to work around. She laid them out on the ground next to the greenhouse pit and spent 3 days arranging and rearranging them, trying to find a configuration that would maximize southern exposure while minimizing weak points where cold could infiltrate. Magnus' drawing showed a roof angled at 42 degrees, steep enough to shed snow, but shallow enough to catch the low winter sun. The windows would be fitted into a framework of 2x4 she'd milled herself from spruce logs using a chainsaw mill Magnus had built from plans he found in Mechanics Illustrated magazine from 1967. The framework would be caulked with pine pitch mixed with animal fat to create a seal that would remain flexible even at extreme temperatures. The actual installation was terrifying. Working at height, alone, handling heavy sheets of glass and wind that could gust to 40 miles per hour without warning. Katrin rigged a pulley system to raise the windows from ground level to the roof framework, operated herself with a rope she'd looped through a block, and tackle anchored to a tripod of lodgepole pine. Each window had to be positioned exactly. The frame squared and level before the glass was caulked in place, because mistakes at this stage would mean cold infiltration that could kill every plant inside, no matter how good the rest of the design was. She broke one window. Number 17, a large double-hung unit she'd been particularly pleased to find because it meant more glass area with less frame. It slipped while she was maneuvering it into position, fell 8 feet, and shattered into pieces too small to use for anything except cutting yourself. Katrin sat down on the roof framework and cried. Not because of the window. She'd expected a break, at least one, but because Magnus would have caught it. Magnus would have been on the ground steadying the pulley while she worked from above, or vice versa, and between the two of them, they would have managed it without loss. Alone, she was just barely competent enough to succeed most of the time, which meant failing some of the time, which meant waste and loss and the constant knowledge that everything would be easier if Magnus were here, and he wasn't, and he never would be again. She finished crying, cleaned up the glass, and continued working. By mid-October, all 22 remaining windows were installed. The greenhouse had a roof that let in light, walls that held back earth, and a door she'd salvaged from an old homestead cabin that was collapsing into itself 20 miles south. The door was solid wood, 3 inches thick, fitted with a latch that still worked and hinges that Katrin oiled until they swung smoothly. Then came the systems. Magnus' design called for multiple heat sources because redundancy meant survival and single points of failure meant death. The primary system was passive solar. The windows angled to catch maximum winter sun, which would be low on the horizon, but still present for a few hours each day, even in December and January. The glass would let in light and trap heat, creating a greenhouse effect that could raise interior temperatures 20 or 30 degrees above ambient on sunny days. The secondary system was thermal mass. Katrin installed 40 water barrels along the south wall, each painted matte black with stove blacking. She mixed herself from soot and linseed oil. The barrels would absorb solar heat during the day and radiate it back at night, buffering temperature swings and preventing the rapid overnight cooling that would kill tender plants. The tertiary system was composting. Katrin built 3 large compost bins from scrap lumber, filling them with a mixture of manure she collected from Hendrickson's horses, old hay, kitchen scraps, and shredded paper. Properly managed, compost could generate significant heat. She'd read accounts of compost piles staying warm enough to steam even when surrounded by snow. The bins would serve double duty, providing both heat and fertilizer for the growing beds. The quaternary system was insulation. She lined the north, east, and west walls with rigid foam panels she'd purchased in Whitestone using money she'd saved from selling Magnus tools. Good tools. Tools he'd maintained carefully. Tools that hurt to part with but that she didn't need and someone else did. The foam had an R value of 30, meaning it would slow heat transfer significantly, keeping the warmth generated inside from leaking out through the walls. The final system was emergency backup, a small wood stove, barely more than a box with pipe, that she could fire up on the coldest nights if the other systems failed. She didn't want to rely on it. Burning would require labor and attention, and represented a failure of the passive systems. But having it meant the difference between losing everything to a cold snap and maintaining enough warmth to keep plants alive until temperatures moderated. By November 1st, when the first serious snow fell, the greenhouse was functional, not finished. She still needed to build the growing beds, install the irrigation system, set up the seed starting area, but functional enough that she could begin testing how well the systems worked. The results surprised her. On a clear day in early November, with outside temperatures at minus 20 Fahrenheit, the interior of the greenhouse reached 58 degrees. The water barrels absorbed heat through the afternoon and released it through the night. keeping the interior above freezing even when the outside temperature dropped to -35. On cloudy days, the temperature gain was less dramatic, maybe 10 degrees above ambient, but still significant enough to create a growing environment that shouldn't have been possible at this latitude and this temperature. The compost bins were working too. Katrin could see steam rising from them on cold mornings, could feel the warmth radiating from the pile when she stood close. She turned them weekly, adding nitrogen-rich materials when they cooled too much, covering them with straw when they generated too much heat, and threatened to kill the beneficial bacteria through overheating. By mid-November, she planted her first seeds: lettuce, spinach, kale, and chard, cold hardy greens that could tolerate near-freezing temperatures if they were protected from wind and given adequate light. She planted them in beds she built from 2x12 Magnus had cut years ago and never used, filled with soil she'd mix herself from compost, peat, and sand. Nothing happened for 2 weeks. The seed sat dormant in soil that was too cold to trigger germination. Katrin checked them daily, her breath forming clouds in the greenhouse air that was warm by Yukon standards but still cold enough to require a heavy coat. Then, on December 1st, she noticed green, tiny sprouts, barely visible, pushing up to the soil in the lettuce bed. She knelt beside them, her heart beating faster than it should, and touched one gently with a gloved finger. The sprout bent but didn't break. It was real. It was alive. It was growing in December in the Yukon when the outside temperature was -42 degrees, and the snow was already 3 feet deep. She sat back on her heels and started laughing. Not because it was funny, but because the alternative was crying, and she'd done enough crying. The greenhouse worked. Magnus' design worked. The thing everyone said was impossible was happening in a pit 12 feet underground on a homestead at the end of the valley, where the winter was trying to kill everything that lived. The lettuce was going to survive, which meant she was going to survive, which meant Magnus was still teaching her things, even though he'd been dead for 20 months. Section 3. The first reveal mystery deepens. The greens grew, not quickly. Nothing grew quickly in December in the Yukon, but they grew steadily, gaining a 1/4 inch of height each week, their leaves unfurling in the dim light that filtered to the greenhouse windows. Katrin tended them with a focus that bordered on obsession, checking soil moisture twice daily, adjusting ventilation to prevent condensation buildup, harvesting the first outer leaves of lettuce on December 28th when they reached a size where removal wouldn't damage the plant. She ate them immediately, standing in the greenhouse with frost on her beard. She'd stopped shaving after Magnus died, let her face grow hair, because caring about appearance required energy she didn't have. The lettuce tasted like lettuce, which doesn't sound remarkable until you understand that it was the first fresh vegetable she'd eaten since September. The first green thing that hadn't come from a can or a jar or her increasingly depleted root cellar, where the potatoes were starting to sprout and the carrots were getting woody. It tasted like summer, like the memory of summer, like proof that winter wasn't permanent, that things could grow even when the world outside was frozen solid, that life persisted if you created the right conditions for it to persist. She ate 4 leaves, saved the rest of the plant. By January, the lettuce beds were producing enough that she could harvest a small salad every 3 days without damaging the plant's ability to regenerate. The spinach was coming on strong, its dark green leaves thick and healthy. The kale was slower, but showing steady growth. The chard had bolted. She'd planted it too close to a heating vent from the compost system, and the temperature differential had triggered flowering. But even the bolted chard was edible, just tougher than it should have been. She started keeping records, daily temperatures inside and outside the greenhouse, plant growth measurements, notes on what worked and what didn't. The records filled a notebook she found in Magnus' tool chest and used, its pages blank until she started filling them with data that would have made her husband proud. Magnus had believed in documentation. Memory lies. He used to say, memory tells you what you want to believe, but numbers tell you what's true. So Katrin wrote down the numbers, turned them into graphs, analyzed patterns, adjusted her techniques based on evidence rather than intuition. The compost system needed more nitrogen than she'd initially provided. She added fish scraps, Frozen pike she caught through the ice on the river, too small to bother eating but perfect for composting. The pile's temperature increased from 110 degrees to 135, generating significantly more heat. The water barrels needed better distribution. The ones nearest the windows were absorbing plenty of solar heat, but the ones farther back stayed cooler. She rearranged them, placing the warmest barrels near the cold-sensitive plants, and using the cooler barrels to moderate temperature in areas where too much heat might cause problems. The ventilation system needed refinement. On sunny days, the greenhouse could overheat, reaching temperatures above 70 degrees that would cause plants to transpire too rapidly and deplete soil moisture faster than she could replace it. She installed adjustable vents near the roof peak that she could open to release excess heat and close to retain warmth overnight. By February, the greenhouse was producing more food than she could eat by herself. Not dramatically more. We're talking about enough lettuce for a small salad every day, enough spinach for a side dish twice a week, enough herbs to make her soups taste like something other than boiled desperation. But in a place where fresh food in winter was considered impossible, enough for one person was a revolution. She brought a basket of lettuce to Sarah Yates at the general store. Sarah looked at the greens like they were a hallucination. Where did you get these? Grew them. In February? In my greenhouse. You're the pit? That's actually working. Sarah took one of the lettuce leaves and held it up to the light, filtering through the store's front window. The leaf was perfect. No brown spots, no insect damage. The kind of quality you'd expect from a commercial operation in California, not a homemade greenhouse in the Yukon in winter. I'll be damned, Sarah said softly. They said you were crazy. They still probably think I'm crazy. They're definitely going to think you're crazy. Sarah set the lettuce down carefully. But they're going to want what you're growing. I'm not selling. You should. People need this. There's been scurvy cases in Whitestone this winter. Tom Hendrickson's oldest boy has bleeding gums. The Marsh family's youngest daughter is covered in bruises that won't heal. Fresh vegetables would fix that. I don't have enough to fix the whole town. You have enough to fix a few people. That's not nothing. Katrin thought about it. About Tom Hendrickson, who'd driven past her greenhouse excavation multiple times without stopping, who'd called a waste of time within her hearing. About his son, bleeding from the gums because his body was breaking down from lack of vitamin C. About whether grudges mattered more than a child's health. I'll bring more next time I come to town, she said. Tell people they can have what I can spare. No charge. They'll pay, Sarah said. People up here understand that labor has value. Magnus would have wanted it free. Magnus isn't here. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. You are, and you worked all summer building that greenhouse. Your labor has value. Katrin left without committing. The question of payment felt complicated in ways she didn't have the energy to untangle. She'd built the greenhouse to survive, not to profit. Sharing the food felt right. Charging for it felt like something else. Something that changed the nature of what she was doing in ways she wasn't sure she liked. But Sarah was right about people needing it. About scurvy being a real problem in northern communities where vitamin C was scarce from October to May. About the fact that having something people needed gave her power she hadn't anticipated wanting, but maybe shouldn't refuse. The word spread. Within a week, 3 families had stopped by her homestead, ostensibly to check if she was surviving the winter okay, actually see if the rumors about the greenhouse were true. Katrin showed them, walked them through the underground structure, explained the systems, let them taste the lettuce she was growing 12 feet below the surface, while the temperature outside was minus 53 degrees, and the wind was making it worse. They were impressed, and confused, and, in some cases, angry in the way people get angry when something they were certain was impossible turns out to be not only possible, but actually happening in front of their eyes. Why didn't you tell anyone this would work? Lars Hendrickson asked. He was Tom's younger brother, a man in his 30s with 3 children and a wife who looked exhausted from the relentless work of keeping a family alive through a northern winter. I did tell people, Katrin said. People didn't believe me. We thought you were. I mean, losing Magnus, we thought maybe you'd. He trailed off. unable to finish the sentence that everyone had been thinking. Lost my mind. Katrin offered. Gone strange? Decided to waste the last years of my life on a project that couldn't possibly work. Something like that. Lars admitted. I was following my husband's plans, using knowledge he learned from a Norwegian engineer who did this in Svalbard. Magnus knew what he was doing. But you're the one who built it, Lars's wife, Anna, said. She was holding their youngest, a baby who couldn't have been more than 6 months old, bundled so completely that only her eyes were visible. You did this yourself. I don't know many men who could have done what you did. Magnus could have. But Magnus isn't here, Anna said, echoing Sarah. You are. They wanted to know if they could buy vegetables. Katrin said she didn't have enough production yet to sell. The plants were still young, still establishing themselves, still learning how to grow in conditions that shouldn't support growth. But she'd bring what she could spare to Whitestone. Leave it with Sarah at the general store. Let people take what they needed. No charge, she insisted. People could pay if they wanted, but payment wasn't required. The food was too important to put behind a price tag that some families couldn't afford. Lars and Anna left with a basket of lettuce and spinach that would give their family fresh greens for several days. They thanked her awkwardly, like people who aren't used to accepting help, who pride themselves on self-sufficiency, but are pragmatic enough to take what's offered when their children's health is on the line. After they left, Katrin stood in the greenhouse and looked at her growing beds. They were doing well, better than well. The lettuce was flourishing. The spinach was thick and healthy. The kale was finally hitting its stride. The herbs, she planted mint, parsley, and chives in late December as an experiment, were all sprouting enthusiastically, apparently unbothered by the fact that they were growing in near darkness in the middle of a Yukon winter. She had created something that worked. Something that defied the conventional wisdom of generations of northern homesteaders who assumed that fresh food in winter was impossible because it had always been impossible, because the winter was too cold and the sun was too weak and the growing season was too short. But possible and impossible weren't fixed categories. They were conclusions based on available knowledge and current technology and the limits of what people were willing to try. Magnus had understood that. He'd seen greenhouse systems working in Svalbard and thought, why not in the Yukon? He'd drawn up plans, started the excavation, died before he could finish. And Katrin had finished it, not because she was special or particularly skilled, but because she'd paid attention to Magnus' drawings, followed his instructions, and worked with focus that came from having nothing else to focus on, no other purpose beyond survival, and proving that Magnus' ideas weren't the fantasies of a dying man, but practical solutions to real problems. The greenhouse was proof that Magnus had been right, proof that Katrin could survive without him even though she didn't particularly want to, proof that impossible is often just shorthand for difficult or untried, or requiring more effort than most people are willing to invest. But the proof was incomplete. The systems were working in February when the temperature was brutal, but the daylight was increasing, when the sun was climbing higher in the sky each day, and the solar gain to the windows was improving. What would happen in December and January when the sun barely rose, when a few hours of daylight came in at such a low angle that the light was weak and gray and barely sufficient to keep plants alive even with perfect conditions? What would happen when the temperature dropped to -80? Because it would. It always did, at least once each winter. A cold snap that came down from the Arctic, pushed by pressure systems that aligned in ways that created killing cold. Coal that froze propane in tanks and made steel brittle and turned the air into something that hurt to breathe. The greenhouse had survived -53 so far. It had maintained interior temperatures in the low 40s, kept the plants alive, produced food that shouldn't have existed. But -80 was different. -80 was a kind of cold that found weaknesses in systems, exploited them, destroyed things that seemed robust until they were tested beyond their design limits. Katrin didn't know if the greenhouse would survive. She had faith in Magnus' design, but faith wasn't knowledge. Knowledge came from testing, from pushing systems until they broke, or proved they wouldn't break, from surviving conditions that should kill you and learning what made survival possible. The real test was coming. She could feel it in the way the wind was shifting, in the particular quality of the cold that settled over the valley like a presence, in the way the ravens had gone silent, conserving energy, knowing something humans could sense but not quite articulate. The killing cold was coming, and when it came, Katrin would learn whether Magnus' greenhouse was engineering or just hope dressed up with glass and timber. The cold came on the third week of February, announced by weather reports crackling over the shortwave radio that Katrin kept tuned to the White Horse Station. The meteorologist's voice carried the particular tension of someone delivering news they wished they didn't have to deliver. Arctic high-pressure systems stalled over the Beaufort Sea. Models showing southward movement beginning Friday evening. Temperature forecast for interior Yukon, -70 to -85 Fahrenheit. Wind chill value significantly lower. Duration, minimum 72 hours, possibly extending to 5 days depending on pressure system movement. Residents are advised to prepare emergency shelters, ensure adequate fuel supplies, and avoid all non-essential outdoor activity. Katrin sat at her kitchen table with a mug of spruce needle tea, vitamin C extracted from fresh-cut evergreen tips, something Magnus had taught her the first winter they spent together, and mentally inventoried her preparations. Firewood, stacked under tarps, enough to burn continuously for 2 weeks. Water, hauled and stored in containers inside the cabin where it wouldn't freeze. Food, adequate, though boring. The root cellar held potatoes, carrots, turnips, and the last of the cabbage she'd harvested in September. Canned moose meat filled most of one shelf. Dried fish hung from the rafters. And the greenhouse that was currently producing more fresh food than she could eat alone, that had proven itself through January and early February, that was about to face a test Magnus, Norwegian engineer, had never anticipated because Svalbard, for all its darkness, rarely saw temperatures this extreme. She needed to prepare the greenhouse, specifically. Check every seal, verify every system, ensure that when the killing cold arrived, the structure would hold together rather than failing catastrophically and taking all her plants with it. Katrin pulled on her boots. Felt-lined mucklucks Magnus had learned to make from a Gwich'in elder, following patterns that were older than written history and more practical than anything white settlers had invented. She layered clothing in the way northerners learned to layer. Wool long underwear, wool pants, wool shirt, down vest, canvas parka with a wool fur ruff that kept the wind from stealing heat from her face. Mittens over glove liners, a wool hat under the parka hood. Outside, the air was already cold enough to make her sinuses ache. -42, according to the thermometer nailed to the cabin wall. The sky was clear, stars visible even though it was mid-morning. The sun wouldn't rise above the mountain for another hour, and when it did, it would barely clear the ridge before beginning its descent. This was a time of year when daylight felt borrowed, temporary, a brief interruption of the darkness that was the North's natural state. The greenhouse entrance was protected by a small vestibule Katrin had built from scrap lumber, creating an airlock that prevented cold air from flowing directly into the growing space when she opened the door. She stepped into the vestibule, closed the outer door, waited 30 seconds for the temperature to moderate, then opened the inner door and descended the wooden stairs into the underground structure. The temperature difference was immediate and dramatic. Outside, -42. Inside the vestibule, maybe -20. Inside the greenhouse itself, 38 degrees. A difference of 80 degrees created by nothing more than soil, insulation, thermal mass, and careful design. The plants were thriving. The lettuce beds were full and green, ready for another harvest. The spinach was at peak production, its leaves dark and thick with chlorophyll. The kale had developed the sweetness that comes from light frost exposure. She'd allowed the temperature to drop to near freezing one night to trigger the chemical changes that convert starches to sugars, improving flavor. The herbs were growing so enthusiastically that she'd started using them in everything, adding mint to her tea, parsley to her soups, chives to the scrambled eggs she made from the dried egg powder in her stores. But Katrin wasn't here to admire the plants. She was here to prepare for cold that would test every component of her system. She started with the seals. The greenhouse windows were caulked with pine, pitch, and tallow, but caulk could crack when temperatures dropped extreme, creating gaps where cold could infiltrate. She walked the perimeter slowly, running her fingers along every window frame, checking for any give or movement that would indicate seal failure. Found 2 spots where the caulk had pulled away slightly from the frame. Not gaps yet, but the beginning of gaps. She'd need to recaulk before the cold snap arrived. The water barrels were next. 40 barrels, each containing 55 gallons of water, painted black to absorb solar heat. The water was currently liquid, temperature around 40 degrees based on Katrin's hand test. She learned to estimate water temperature within a few degrees just by touch, a skill that seemed useless until it became essential. But at -80 outside, even with 12 feet of earth between the barrels and the surface, the temperature inside the greenhouse would drop. The question was how much. Magnus' calculations suggested the greenhouse interior should stay above freezing even at -80 outside, assuming the thermal mass held and the insulation performed as designed. But those calculations were based on steady-state conditions, a constant exterior temperature, not the reality of day-night temperature swings, solar gain variations, and the thousand small ways that real-world systems deviated from theoretical models. If the temperature inside dropped below 32 degrees for any significant duration, the water in the barrels would freeze. Freezing water expanded. Expanding water would burst the barrels. Burst barrels would mean lost thermal mass and flooded growing beds and possibly structural damage if the ice pushed against the walls in unexpected ways. Katrin had prepared for this possibility. She'd added automotive antifreeze to 10 of the barrels at a ratio of 1 gallon antifreeze to 4 gallons water, lowering the freezing point to approximately 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Those barrels would remain liquid unless the greenhouse catastrophically failed. The other 30 barrels were pure water, more efficient for heat storage, but vulnerable if temperatures dropped too far. She checked each barrel now, tapping the side to verify they were still liquid, looking for any signs of ice formation on the surface. All clear so far. But so far meant nothing when the real cold was still 3 days away. The compost bins were generating heat exactly as designed. Katrin could see steam rising from them in the relatively cool greenhouse air, could feel warmth radiating from the pile when she stood close. She'd turned them 2 days ago, mixing the partially decomposed material from the center to the outside, and vice versa, redistributing the heat-generating bacteria throughout the pile. The temperature in the bin centers was running around 125 degrees. Not as hot as they'd been in January, but still producing significant BTUs. She added more nitrogen. Fish scraps she'd been saving, blood from a snowshoe hare she'd snared last week, kitchen waste that was heavy on protein. The bacterial action would increase. The pile would heat up, and the additional warmth would help buffer the greenhouse temperature when the cold snap arrived. The insulation was the one component she couldn't easily check. The rigid foam panels were sealed behind the timber reinforcement, invisible once installed, performing their function silently in the space between earth and growing area. Either they were working or they weren't, and she wouldn't know which until the temperature outside dropped to extremes, and she saw whether the temperature inside stayed livable. Magnus had specified R30 insulation, 3 inches of closed-cell polyurethane foam. She'd installed it carefully, sealing every joint with expanding foam to eliminate thermal bridges, covering it with a vapor barrier to prevent moisture intrusion. The work had been tedious and expensive and had consumed a week of her summer when she could have been doing other things. But Magnus' drawings had been emphatic. Insulation was the foundation of everything else. Without adequate insulation, all the solar gain and thermal mass and composting heat in the world would leak away faster than it could be generated. She trusted the insulation because Magnus had taught her to trust it. He'd shown her the mathematics. Heat loss through walls was a function of temperature difference, surface area, and R value. The greater the R value, the slower the heat loss. At R30, the walls would lose approximately 1 BTU per hour per square foot per degree of temperature difference. The greenhouse had roughly 800 square feet of wall area. At -80 outside and 40 degrees inside, a 120-degree difference. The heat loss would be about 96,000 BTUs per hour. That sounded like a lot until you realized the compost bins were generating approximately 150,000 BTUs per hour when running at peak output, and the water barrels contained enough stored heat to buffer temperature swings for days, and the solar gain during even short winter days could add another 50,000 BTUs if the sky was clear. The numbers worked. On paper. Magnus had been confident enough in the mathematics to bet their survival on it. Now Katrin was betting hers, and potentially the survival of everyone in Whitestone who had come to depend on the fresh vegetables she'd been bringing to town each week. Because that was the other dimension of this. The greenhouse wasn't just keeping Katrin alive anymore. It was keeping other people alive. Tom Hendrickson's son, whose bleeding gums had stopped once he started eating the lettuce and spinach Katrin provided. The Marsh girl, whose bruising had healed once her diet included fresh greens rich in vitamin K. Sarah Yates, who'd been complaining of fatigue and weakness until Katrin brought her a basket of spinach, and her energy returned within days. Scurvy was subtle in its early stages. It presented as tiredness, as minor wounds that didn't heal properly, as a general sense of physical deterioration that people attributed to winter and hard living and getting older. By the time the symptoms became obvious, bleeding gums, loose teeth, bruising, joint pain, the deficiency was severe enough to be dangerous. Katrin had been monitoring the town informally through Sarah, who kept track of who was buying what at the general store and who was showing signs of nutritional deficiency. The list was longer than Katrin had expected. At least 15 people in Whitestone were displaying symptoms consistent with inadequate vitamin C intake. Another dozen were probably borderline, not sick enough to notice yet, but not healthy either. The vegetables she'd been providing were helping, but she didn't have enough production to supply everyone who needed it. The greenhouse was still young, the plants still establishing themselves, the system still finding their equilibrium. She was harvesting maybe 5 pounds of greens per week, enough for a few families, not enough for the entire community. If the greenhouse survived the cold snap, she could expand production, plant more beds, optimize the systems based on what she'd learned, potentially double or triple her output by next winter. If the greenhouse failed, people would go back to relying on stored foods that lost nutritional value with each passing month, and the scurvy cases would multiply, and some of them would become severe enough to cause permanent damage or death. No pressure. Katrin finished her inspection and stood in the center of the greenhouse, breathing an air that smelled like growing things, like soil and green leaves and the faint sweetness of compost. Around her, the plants grew silently, unconcerned about cold snaps or pressure systems or the fact that their existence defied generations of conventional wisdom about what was possible in the north. They grew because the conditions allowed them to grow. Temperature adequate, light sufficient, water available, nutrients present. The plants didn't care that it was February in the Yukon. They cared that their immediate environment supported growth. Everything else was irrelevant. If only human survival were that simple. She climbed the stairs, passed through the vestibule, emerged into cold that felt hostile after the relative warmth underground. The sun had finally cleared the ridge, its light weak and gray, casting long shadows across the snow. Katrin looked at the sky, still clear, but with a quality to the light that suggested change coming. The kind of change that killed things. 3 days until the cold snap arrived. 3 days to reinforce seals, add insulation where possible, prepare backup systems, and hope that Magnus engineering was as good as she believed it was. 3 days to prepare for a test that would prove whether the greenhouse was a functional survival system or just an expensive way to delay the inevitable. The village of Whitestone sat in a wide valley where a creek that was optimistically called a river during spring runoff provided water, and a dirt track that was optimistically called a road provided occasional connection to the outside world. 47 people lived here in summer when the weather was tolerable and work was available. 32 people stayed through winter when staying required genuine commitment to either the place or the delusion that next year will be better. The village had grown around a trading post established in 1902, expanded during a minor gold rush in 1923, contracted when the gold ran out, and stabilized at its current size through a combination of stubbornness and lack of better options. The people who lived here were trappers, subsistence hunters, small-scale miners who panned for gold that was still technically present but no longer economically viable to extract, and families who'd been born here and saw no reason to leave just because the winters were brutal and the nearest city was 200 miles away. Sarah Yates ran the general store, which also served as a post office, the community gathering space, an informal center of village governance. She was 58 years old, had lived in Whitestone for 33 years, and knew everyone's business whether they wanted her to or not. She kept track of who was buying what, who was running low on supplies, who was struggling and who was thriving. She extended credit to families who needed it and collected debts from people who could pay them, operating the store as a quasi-charitable institution that somehow stayed solvent through a combination of careful management and the fact that she owned the building outright and didn't need much profit to survive. Sarah was worried. The food situation in Whitestone was worse than most people realized. Winter had come early this year. Serious snow in late September, temperatures dropping below zero by mid-October. The early cold had caught people unprepared. Gardens that should have produced until early October froze in September. Root vegetables that should have been harvested in late September were lost when the ground froze before people could dig them up. The moose hunt had been poor. Hunters had only taken 3 animals total for the entire community, when they usually managed 6 or 7. The result was that stored food supplies were running lower than they should be at this point in the season. March was still 2 weeks away, and March in the Yukon was still winter. The temperature didn't moderate until April, and nothing grew until May at the earliest. People needed to make their food stores last another 2.5 months, and some families were already scraping the bottom of their barrels. The scurvy was making it worse. People who were already nutritionally compromised got sick more easily, healed more slowly, had less energy for the work that survival required. The vitamin C deficiency was creating a cascade of problems that affected everything from wound healing to cold resistance to mental health. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible mountain stories like this one. Katrin's vegetables had been helping. The lettuce and spinach she'd been bringing every week weren't abundant, but they were enough to make a difference for the most vulnerable people. The Hendrickson boys' gums had stopped bleeding. The Marsh girls' bruising had healed. Old Michael Johansson, who'd been showing signs of scurvy for months, had perked up noticeably after eating fresh greens for 2 weeks straight. But Katrin's production was limited. She had maybe 5 pounds of greens available each week, and she was distributing them based on need rather than ability to pay, which meant the people who needed them most were getting them, but there wasn't enough to go around. Sarah had a waiting list of families who wanted access to the vegetables, but Katrin kept saying she didn't have enough production yet, that the greenhouse was still new, that she needed time to expand the growing beds and optimize the systems. Time was exactly what they didn't have. Sarah was standing behind the counter of the general store, updating her inventory records, when the door opened and Robert Cheney walked in. Robert was the closest thing Whitestone had to a mayor, though the position was unofficial and consisted mainly of organizing community work parties and mediating disputes that threatened to turn into something worse. He was 43, had grown up in the territory, and possessed the kind of practical competence that made people trust his judgment even when they didn't particularly like him. "We need to talk about the cold snap," Robert said without preamble. "I've been telling people prepare," Sarah said. "Stock up on fuel, haul water. Make sure they've got enough food to wait out." "That's not what I'm worried about." Robert leaned against the counter, his expression troubled. "I'm worried about what happens after." "After?" "The cold snap is going to last at least 3 days, maybe 5. People are going to burn through fuel faster than normal trying to stay warm. They're going to eat more because cold weather increases caloric needs. When it's over, we're going to have families who depleted their reserves with still 2 months of winter left to get through." Sarah set down her pencil. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I've been doing a census, talking to families, asking about food stores, trying to get a realistic picture of who's got what." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "These are the families I'm worried about." Sarah took the paper and read the list. 8 families, 34 people total, including 16 children under the age of 12. These were people who'd been struggling before the cold snap, who come into winter with inadequate supplies, who were already rationing food and would be in genuine trouble if they had to endure an extended crisis. "The Voights are on here," Sarah said, surprised. "I thought they were doing okay." They were, but Helmut had medical issues in January. Something with his back. Couldn't work for 3 weeks. They burned through their buffer. Greta's been buying on credit, which you know about, but what you don't know is that they're down to about 3 weeks of food. That was before the cold snap. After, They'll have maybe 10 days if they're careful. Jesus, the marshes are worse. They've got 6 kids and about a week's worth of food. Maybe less. I saw their root cellar. It's nearly empty. Sarah thought about the marsh girl, the one with the bruising that Katrin's vegetables had healed. They've been eating Katrin's greens, which is why they're not sicker than they are. But lettuce doesn't have calories. It's got vitamins, which is critical. But vitamins don't keep you warm or give you energy. They need protein, fat, carbohydrates. They need food with substance. Can we organize a community redistribution? People who have extras share with people who don't. I've already tried. Some families are willing, but most are worried about their own supplies. Nobody wants to share, when sharing might mean they run out before spring. Sarah studied the list again. 8 families, 34 people. In a community of 32 permanent residents, that meant more than half the village was at risk. What do you want me to do? I want you to talk to Katrin. Katrin's already sharing everything she can grow. She doesn't have enough production to feed this many people. I'm not talking about vegetables, Robert said. I'm talking about the greenhouse itself, the engineering, the systems. If Katrin's greenhouse works, if it can produce food through winter in conditions we thought were impossible, then other people need to learn how to build them. We need greenhouses throughout the village, multiple food sources, redundancy. That takes time. You can't build a greenhouse in the middle of winter. No, but we can plan for next summer. We can get Katrin to teach people how she did it, share Magnus drawings, explain the systems, help other families build their own structures before next winter. It was a reasonable plan, the kind of long-term thinking that made Robert effective as an informal leader. But Sarah knew something Robert didn't. She won't share, Sarah said quietly. What? The drawings, the engineering, Magnus journal with the Norwegian designs. Katrin won't share them. Why the hell not? Because they're all she has left of Magnus. Because they're private. Because sharing them feels like losing him again. Sarah had tried to raise this with Katrin a month ago, suggesting that making copies of Magnus' journal would be a service to community. Katrin had shut down the conversation immediately, saying the journal was personal and not for distribution. Robert's jaw tightened. People are going to starve, Sarah. Children are going to starve. And Katrin's sitting on knowledge that could prevent that because she's too attached to a dead man's notebook. It's more complicated than that. It's really not. She either cares about this community or she doesn't. She either helps people survive or she keeps her secrets and watches people die. There's no middle ground here. Sarah wanted to argue, to defend Katrin, to explain that grief made people irrational and possessive and that you couldn't logic someone out of feelings they didn't logic themselves into. But Robert wasn't wrong about the stakes. People needed help. Katrin had knowledge that could provide that help. Whether or not she was emotionally ready to share was unfortunate, but ultimately irrelevant when lives were at stake. I'll talk to her, Sarah said. After the cold snap passes, I'll explain the situation, show her the list, make the case for sharing Magnus designs. And if she says no, then we'll deal with that when it happens. Robert left, and Sarah returned to her inventory, but the numbers blurred on the page. She kept thinking about Katrin, alone on her homestead with a greenhouse full of food, possessive of knowledge that could save lives, grieving a man who'd been dead for 2 years and still occupied more space in her life than any living person. Sarah understood grief. She'd lost her own husband to a logging accident when she was 41, and the first year after his death had been a darkness she wasn't sure she'd emerge from. But she had people around her, community support, reasons to keep going beyond her own survival. Katrin had none of that. She'd isolated herself, turned inward, built her life around maintaining connection to Magnus through the greenhouse project that had been his dream. The greenhouse worked. That was the problem. If it had failed, Katrin would have been forced to move on, to find other ways of surviving, to engage with the community out of necessity. But because it worked, she could stay isolated, keep living in the world she'd built with Magnus, avoid dealing with the fact that Magnus was gone and wasn't coming back. The cold snap would test more than just the greenhouse systems. It would test Katrin's willingness to be part of the community again, to share what she knew, to let Magnus' legacy be something larger than private grief. Sarah hoped Katrin would pass that test, but she wasn't confident. Section 5, The Deeper Secret, Second Layer Revelation. The cold arrived on schedule, announced by a wind that shifted from west to north and brought with it air that felt like breathing broken glass. Katrin was in her cabin when it started, monitoring the shortwave radio while tending the wood stove that kept the single room livable. The temperature outside had been dropping steadily since dawn, -50 at sunrise, -58 by noon, -63 by mid-afternoon. The radio meteorologist sounded increasingly tense as updated forecasts came through. Current temperature in Whitehorse, -67. Current temperature in Dawson, -71. Reports from interior weather stations show temperatures reaching -78 with wind gusts to 30 miles per hour. Effective wind chill values approaching -110 Fahrenheit. This is an extremely dangerous situation. All residents should remain indoors. Do not attempt to travel. Do not attempt outdoor work unless absolutely necessary for immediate survival. Katrin pulled on her layers and prepared to check the greenhouse. The trip from cabin to greenhouse was only about 60 feet, but at these temperatures, 60 feet could kill you if something went wrong. She'd strung a rope between the buildings years ago. Magnus had insisted on it, said that whiteout conditions could disorient you so completely that you'd walk past your own door without seeing it. The rope was insurance. You held it, followed it, didn't let go. She stepped outside into cold that was beyond cold. It was a physical presence, a force that attacked exposed flesh immediately. Katrin's face was covered except for her eyes, a balaclava under a parka hood. The wool fur ruff pulled forward to create a tunnel of warmer air, but even through all those layers, she could feel the temperature trying to steal heat from her body faster than her metabolism could generate it. She grabbed the rope and started walking. The wind was intermittent, gusting and then dying, then gusting again. Each gust felt like being hit with something solid. The cold penetrated her parka, found the gaps around her wrists and neck, tried to work its way under her layers. Her lungs ached from breathing air this cold, even through the balaclava that was supposed to pre-warm it. Her eyes watered, and the tears froze on her eyelashes, forcing her to blink hard to clear them. 60 feet had never felt longer. She reached the greenhouse vestibule, fumbled with the door latch. Her mittens were too thick to operate. She had to take one off, use her glove liner-covered hand, get the latch open, get inside, close the door behind her. The vestibule was cold, maybe -40, but it felt warm compared to outside. She stood there for a full minute, letting her body adjust, feeling sensation return to her hand that had been exposed for maybe 10 seconds. 10 seconds. That's how long it took for the cold to start causing damage. She opened the inner door and descended into the greenhouse. The temperature here was 31 degrees, just above freezing. Cold enough that Katrin could see her breath, but survivable, workable, the kind of cold where plants could stay alive if they were hardy enough. The lettuce looked stressed. The leaves had a darker color than normal, a sign that the plants were producing antifreeze compounds to protect their cells from ice crystal formation. But they were alive, still growing, just slower. The spinach was fine. Spinach thrived in cold, could survive light frost without damage, would actually taste sweeter after cold exposure as starches converted to sugars. The kale was unbothered. Kale was nearly indestructible, would survive temperatures down to the low 20s if it had to. Katrin checked the water barrels. The pure water barrels were starting to form ice on the surface, thin sheets that she could break with her hand, but ice nonetheless. The antifreeze mixed barrels were still liquid, their thermal mass intact, doing the work they were designed to do. She'd need to monitor this carefully. If the pure water barrels froze solid, she'd lose significant thermal buffering capacity. The compost bins were still generating heat. She could see steam rising from them even in the 31-degree air. The piles had cooled slightly, down from 125 degrees to maybe 110, but they were still active, still producing BTUs, still helping to keep the greenhouse above freezing. This was the first real test. Outside, -78. Inside, 31. A temperature difference of 109 degrees, maintained by nothing but soil, insulation, thermal mass, and composting bacteria. The systems were working. Not perfectly. She was closer to freezing than she liked, but working well enough to keep the plants alive. For now, the forecast called for temperatures to stay at these extremes for at least 3 days. Maybe 5. The greenhouse might hold for 3 days. 5 would be pushing the limits of what the systems could do. If the temperature outside dropped even lower, and it could... The forecast was just a prediction, not a certainty. Then the greenhouse temperature would drop proportionally. Another 10 degrees colder outside could mean the difference between plants that survived and plants that froze. Katrin spent an hour in the greenhouse, monitoring systems, checking for problems, trying to think of ways to add more heat without burning wood continuously, which would require attention she couldn't provide around the clock. She was one person. She needed to sleep. The greenhouse needed to function without her for hours at a time. She added more nitrogen to compost bins, fish scraps, blood, protein waste that would accelerate bacterial activity. The pile started heating up almost immediately, temperature rising from 110 to 118 degrees within 30 minutes. Good. That would buy her some buffer. She adjusted the water barrel arrangement, moving the antifreeze barrels closer to the most vulnerable plants and using the pure water barrels as a secondary line of defense. If the pure barrels froze, they'd at least provide some insulation before she could thaw them out. She checked the seals again. No gaps, no obvious air infiltration, but she added more caulk anyway in the spots that looked even slightly questionable at these temperatures. Even a small gap could create enough cold infiltration to kill plants near the breach. Then she climbed back out, made the journey through the vestibule to the outside, grabbed the rope, and walked back to her cabin through cold that was trying to kill her with every second of exposure. Inside, she stripped off the outer layers and stood by the wood stove, shivering not from cold exactly, but from a physiological response to extreme temperature stress. Her body had burned a significant number of calories just making that round trip. She'd need to eat more than usual to maintain her energy reserves. She made herself a meal, moose meat fried in its own fat, with potatoes from the root cellar and a side of sautéed kale from the greenhouse. The kale tasted sweet and rich, its cells full of sugars the plant had manufactured in response to cold stress. She ate slowly, savoring the green vegetable that shouldn't exist in February in the Yukon, grateful for Magnus engineering that had made this possible. The radio crackled. Updated temperature readings. Whitehorse minus 71. Dawson minus 76. Interior stations reporting minus 82. This is now officially the coldest temperature recorded in the Yukon since January 1947. Wind gusts continue at 25 to 30 miles per hour. Effective wind chill values are approaching minus 120 Fahrenheit. Propane is freezing in outdoor tanks. Vehicle fuel lines are gelling. Several reports of frozen water pipes in inadequately insulated buildings. Emergency services are suspended until temperatures moderate. Residents are on their own until the system passes. Minus 82, and still getting colder. Katrin looked at her cabin walls. The logs Magnus had cut and placed were chinked with moss and mud that had dried and hardened and done its job for 17 years. The sod roof held snow that provided additional insulation. The wood stove was burning hot, maintaining interior temperature around 65 degrees. The cabin was warm. She was safe. But the greenhouse was at the edge of its operational limits. The systems were working now. But for how much longer? And what would happen if the temperature outside dropped to minus 90 or minus 100, which had happened once in living memory, during the winter of 1947 that the radio had just mentioned? She couldn't control the weather. She could only monitor the systems and make adjustments where possible, and hope that Magnus engineering was robust enough to handle conditions that were testing its absolute limits. She checked the greenhouse again at midnight. Temperature inside, 29 degrees. Outside, minus 85. The pure water barrels were frozen solid. The antifreeze barrels were still liquid, but starting to get slushy. The compost bins were down to 105 degrees. The plants looked more stressed. The lettuce leaves were wilting slightly. The spinach had darkened further. Even the kale was showing signs of cold damage. Katrin fired up the emergency wood stove. She'd hoped to avoid this, wanted the greenhouse to function on passive systems alone. But 29 degrees was too close to freezing. Another degree or two and she'd start losing plants. The wood stove was insurance she couldn't afford not to use. She loaded it with dry spruce, got a fire going, adjusted the damper to maintain a slow, steady burn that would produce heat while consuming so much wood that she'd deplete her fuel supply. The stove was small. It didn't take much wood to make a difference in a space that was already being heated by other systems. Within an hour, the greenhouse temperature had risen to 34 degrees. Still cold, but no longer critical. She'd need to tend the fire every few hours, which meant not sleeping for the duration of the cold snap, which was fine. Sleep was for people who had the luxury of not worrying about whether their food supply would survive the night. At 3 a.m., while Katrin was adding wood to the greenhouse stove, Helmut Voigt's water pipe froze and burst. Helmut discovered it when he went to get water for morning coffee and found the hand pump in his kitchen wouldn't draw. He spent 30 minutes trying to thaw the pipe with a propane torch before realizing the pipe had cracked and the water had drained out into the space under his cabin where it was now frozen solid. No water meant no coffee, no cooking, no washing, no way to maintain basic hygiene. It meant hauling water from a source that was currently frozen. The creek was solid ice under 3 feet of snow, and even if Helmut could reach it, which he couldn't safely at minus 87 degrees, he'd have to chop through ice to reach liquid water. His only option was melting snow, which required fuel to heat the snow, and more fuel than he'd budgeted for, because he hadn't anticipated losing his water supply in the middle of a cold snap. Helmut was a pragmatic man who understood that complaining about problems was less useful than solving them. But even he felt a wave of despair as he calculated how much additional fuel he'd need to burn to melt enough snow to meet his family's water needs for the next 3 to 5 days. They'd run through their supply faster than planned, which meant they'd have less fuel for heating, which meant the house would be colder, which meant they'd need to eat more to maintain body temperature, which meant depleting their food stores faster. It was a cascade, one system failure leading to another, then another, each problem compounding the next until the margin for survival that had seemed adequate suddenly wasn't. Greta found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the hand pump that wouldn't work. "We'll manage," she said. "Will we?" "We always have. This is different." She knew he was right. They'd survived hard winters before, but never while already running low on supplies, never with Helmut's back still not fully recovered from the injury that had cost him 3 weeks of work, never with the cold this extreme, and their reserves this depleted. "We could ask for help," Greta said. "From who?" "Everyone's dealing with their own problems. Nobody has extra fuel or food to spare. Sarah might. Sarah can't magic supplies into existence. The store has limited stock. We're already buying on credit we can't really afford, and borrowing more just means we'll be deeper in debt when spring comes." They sat in silence. Two people who'd built a life in the North through a combination of hard work and careful planning, now facing the reality that sometimes hard work and planning weren't enough when conditions exceeded your worst-case scenarios. Similar conversations were happening in other households. The Marshes discovered their propane had frozen in the tank, rendering their backup heater inoperable. The Hendricksons ran out of lamp oil and were down to candles that cast barely enough light to see by. The Johnsons lost a window seal, just one window, but enough to create a cold spot that made the bedroom uninhabitable and forced the entire family to sleep in the front room near the wood stove. Each family was managing their individual crisis, not realizing that their individual crises were part of a larger pattern, not understanding that what was happening to them was happening to most of the village simultaneously. Robert Cheney understood. He'd been doing rounds when it was safe to be outside, brief trips between houses, checking on people, taking mental notes of who was struggling and how badly. The picture emerging was worse than his initial assessment. The 8 families on his list were in trouble, but so were at least 4 others who'd seemed okay before the cold snap, but were now burning through reserves faster than anticipated. 12 families, 53 people total, in a community of 32 permanent residents. That meant, he stopped, did the math again. The numbers didn't make sense. 32 permanent residents, but 53 people at risk? Then he realized the numbers were from different counts. 32 permanent residents, men adults who maintained year-round homesteads. 53 people included children, elderly relatives staying with family for the winter, temporary residents who planned to leave before winter but hadn't. The community was larger and more vulnerable than the official count suggested. Robert sat in his own cabin, updating his lists, trying to figure out how to organize a response to a crisis that was still unfolding, that wouldn't fully reveal itself until the cold snap passed, and he could see who'd made it through and who hadn't. The radio crackled. Current temperature, -89. This is now the coldest temperature recorded in Yukon territory since records began in 1897. Wind continues at 20 to 30 miles per hour. Conditions are expected to persist for at least 48 more hours. Emergency services remain suspended. Residents should assume they are completely isolated until temperatures moderate enough for safe travel. -89. Robert had lived in the north his entire life. He'd experienced cold that froze diesel fuel in engines and made steel brittle enough to shatter. He'd survived blizzards that buried his cabin to the roof peak and cold snaps that killed livestock in their barns. But he'd never seen -89. Nobody living had seen -89. This was history-making cold, the kind that became a reference point for future winters. Remember 87? People would say, nothing's been that cold since. Assuming people survived to remember it, Katrin was on her third trip to the greenhouse that night when she realized the situation was more serious than she thought. The greenhouse temperature had dropped to 32 degrees despite the wood stove running continuously. The compost bins were down to 95 degrees. The antifreeze barrels were definitely slushy now, their heat storage capacity diminishing as they approached their freezing point. She added more wood to the stove, turned the compost piles, adding fresh nitrogen material, even though she'd already turned them twice in the past 24 hours. Checked every plant individually, looking for signs of cold damage that would indicate the systems were failing. The lettuce was dying, not all of it. The plants closest to the wood stove were okay, but the beds farther from the heat source were showing clear signs of cold injury. The leaf edges were turning brown and translucent, cell walls rupturing as ice crystals formed inside the plant tissue. The spinach was holding on barely. The kale was fine, would probably survive even if the temperature dropped a few more degrees. But the lettuce was going, and lettuce was a crop that had the highest vitamin C content, the crop that was most effective at preventing scurvy, the crop that people needed most. Katrin felt something twist in her chest. Not panic. She was too experienced at managing crises to panic, but a deep sense of anger that felt almost like grief. She'd built this. She'd dug for a full summer, installed systems that should work, followed Magnus' drawings exactly. And the greenhouse was working, was producing food that shouldn't exist, was doing everything it was designed to do. But it wasn't enough. The cold was too extreme. The systems couldn't compensate for temperatures that exceeded their design parameters. Magnus, Norwegian engineer, had never anticipated -89. Nobody had. She could save some plants by consolidating them near the wood stove, sacrificing quantity for quality, maintaining a small growing area that would survive while letting the rest freeze. It was triage, practical, the only rational choice. But it meant less food, less vitamin C, less capacity to help the people in Whitestone who were depending on her production to stay healthy through the remainder of winter. She made the decision, started moving plants, relocating the healthiest specimens to the area immediately surrounding the wood stove. She could keep maybe 25% of her current production alive. The rest would be lost. 25% of 5 pounds per week was 1.25 pounds. Enough for maybe 2 families. Not enough for the 15 people Sarah had said were showing scurvy symptoms. Not nearly enough. As she worked, transferring plants, respacing them to maximize their chance of survival, Katrin found herself talking to Magnus. "Your design was good," she said aloud to the empty greenhouse. "It worked until it didn't. Until the cold was too much. I don't know what else to do." Magnus didn't answer because Magnus was dead, but in her mind, she heard his voice anyway, the way she'd heard it 1,000 times during their years together. Systems fail. That's not your fault. What matters is what you do next. What she did next was keep working. Say what she could save. Let go of what she couldn't. Survive. Outside, the temperature dropped to -92. The coldest temperature ever recorded in the Yukon territory. The kind of cold that entered legend. The kind of cold that killed. The cold broke on the 5th day. Not suddenly. Nothing in the north happened suddenly except death. The temperature climbed slowly from -92 to -85, then to -78, then to -65 over the course of 18 hours. The wind died to nothing. The sky cleared completely, revealing stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Katrin stood outside her cabin at dawn, breathing air that felt almost warm at -52, and watched the sun rise over the mountains. She'd been awake for 5 days straight, catching only brief naps between greenhouse checks, surviving on coffee and moose jerky, and the determination that you didn't die just because you were tired. The greenhouse had survived. Barely. She'd lost 60% of her production. The lettuce beds farthest from the wood stove were completely frozen. The plants turned to mush that would have to be composted. But the core growing area near the stove had made it through. 20 plants that were still alive, still producing, still representing food that shouldn't exist in February in the Yukon. 20 plants wasn't enough. Not for 15 people with scurvy symptoms. Not for the families Sarah had mentioned who were struggling. Not for a community that Katrin was beginning to realize needed her greenhouse more than she'd understood. She needed to expand production. Needed more growing space, better systems, redundant heat sources that could handle extreme cold without failing. But expansion meant time, labor, resources she didn't have alone. It meant asking for help, which meant engaging with community in ways she'd been avoiding since Magnus died. It meant letting go of her isolation and admitting that she couldn't do this alone anymore. The realization felt like defeat and relief in equal measure. Sarah Yates appeared at Katrin's homestead 3 days after the cold snap ended, driving a snowmobile that sputtered and died twice on the trail because the fuel was still partially gel from the extreme temperatures. She looked exhausted. Everyone looked exhausted, the kind of tiredness that came from sustained crisis rather than just physical labor. "We need to talk," Sarah said, accepting the cup of spruce tea Katrin offered and warming her hands around it. "About the vegetables. I know. I lost most of my production during the cold snap. I've only got enough to supply maybe 2 families now. It's worse than that." Sarah pulled a folded paper from her pocket. Robert Cheney's list, updated after the crisis. 12 families are in trouble. Real trouble. The Voigs lost their water system, been burning extra fuel to melt snow. The marsh's propane froze. Their backup heat is gone. For other families had various system failures. Broken pipes, failed seals, depleted fuel supplies they can't replace until the supply truck comes through in April. Katrin studied the list. 53 people. More than a third of them children under 12. What do they need? Everything. Food, fuel, functional systems to get them through the next 8 weeks until spring. But mostly they need what you have. "I told you, I don't have enough production." "Not vegetables," Sarah interrupted. "Knowledge. Magnus designs. The engineering that makes your greenhouse work. Robert wants to organize a community build this summer. Get everyone working together to construct greenhouses throughout the village. Multiple food sources. Redundancy. So next winter, we're not dependent on stored foods that run out." Katrin felt her chest tighten. Magnus' journal is private. "Katrin, children are going to get scurvy. People are going to suffer because they don't know how to do what you did. You're sitting on information that could prevent that. It's all I have left of him." "No." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "What you have left of Magnus is the greenhouse, the thing he designed that you built, the proof that his ideas worked. Sharing those ideas doesn't diminish his legacy. It expands it. It makes him matter to more people than just you." Katrin looked at her hands. Calloused, scarred, strong from 2 years of solitary labor. Magnus' hands had looked similar. Working hands. Hands that built things that lasted. "I don't know if I can," she said quietly. "Then don't decide now, but come to town. See what's happening. Talk to the families who are struggling. Meet Robert hear his plan, then decide. Section 7. The Stand Major Confrontation. Whitestone's community hall was a log building that served as meeting space, church, school, and emergency shelter depending on what the community needed on any given day. 40 people packed into the single room, everyone who could travel the distance in the lingering cold that still hovered around -40. Robert Cheney stood at the front, next to a chalkboard where he'd sketched diagrams of greenhouse construction based on what little he'd been able to observe of Katrin's structure from the outside. "The key is depth," he was saying as Katrin entered. "Underground construction provides thermal mass and insulation. If we organize work parties, pool our labor, we could potentially build 3 or 4 greenhouses this summer, enough to supply the entire community with fresh vegetables through next winter. How do you know it'll work?" This from Tom Hendrickson, whose skepticism about Katrin's project had been vocal before the cold snap. "We've never built anything like this before." "Because Katrin's already proved it works," Robert said, gesturing to where Katrin stood near the door. "Her greenhouse survived temperatures that killed everything else, kept producing food when everyone else was living on canned goods and root vegetables from storage." Every head turned. Katrin felt the weight of their attention, their need, their unspoken questions about whether she'd help or hoard her knowledge like treasures she couldn't spend. "Show them," Sarah said quietly from beside her. "Show them Magnus drawings." Katrin pulled the journal from her pack. Magnus' journal, the one he'd kept for 20 years, filled with observations about weather patterns, animal behavior, plant growth, and, in the final pages, the detailed engineering diagrams he'd copied from the Norwegians' designs. She'd carried it to town not sure if she'd be able to share it. Not sure if letting other people see Magnus' handwriting and Magnus' thoughts would feel like betrayal or release. She walked to the front of the hall, set the journal on the table, where everyone could see. "This was my husband's," she said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. She'd spent 2 years mostly talking to herself and the plants. Speaking to a room full of people required conscious effort. He spent years planning this greenhouse, learning from someone who'd built similar systems in Norway. He started the excavation the summer before he died. "I finished it because I didn't know what else to do with my grief except put it into something that would last." She opened the journal to the first engineering diagram, a cross-section showing the greenhouse's depth, the insulation layers, the thermal mass system. The drawing was precise, labeled in Magnus' careful handwriting, annotated with calculations and notes. "The design works because it uses the Earth's constant temperature as a baseline," Katrin explained. 12 feet down, the ground stays around 40 degrees year-round. That's your starting point. Everything else, the insulation, the solar gain, the composting heat, the water barrel thermal mass, builds on that foundation. She walked them through each system, explained the R values of different insulation materials, the importance of southern exposure for solar gain, the bacterial processes that made compost generate heat, the way water stored daytime warmth and released it at night. She shared Magnus' calculations about heat loss and heat gain, about the BTUs required to maintain livable temperatures at different extremes, about the redundancy built into systems that had to function without constant human intervention. The room was silent except for her voice and the scratch of pencils as people took notes. Even Tom Hendrickson was writing, his skepticism apparently overcome by the detailed engineering that proved this wasn't luck or wishful thinking, but solid design based on thermodynamics and practical experience. "The cold snap almost killed my greenhouse," Katrin admitted. "I lost most of my production because the temperature exceeded the design parameters. But the core systems held. The plants near the heat sources survived, which means the engineering is sound. It just needs better backup systems for extreme conditions." "What kind of backup systems?" Robert asked. "More thermal mass, larger compost bins, better insulation, maybe small propane heaters that kick in automatically when temperature drops below a threshold, redundancy at every level, so that no single system failure causes total collapse. Can you teach us to build that?" Katrin looked at the journal, at Magnus' handwriting, at the legacy he'd left that was larger than just the two of them. "Yes," she said, "I can teach you." The response was immediate. families volunteering for work parties, people offering to donate materials or labor, or both. A collective commitment to solving the problem together rather than struggling individually. But then John Pritchard stood up. John was a man in his 50s who'd been in Whitestone longer than anyone except Sarah. He owned the largest homestead in the valley, ran a trap line that generated enough income that he could afford to buy supplies instead of scavenging, and generally held the opinion that people who couldn't provide for themselves deserved their struggles. "This is foolishness," John said flatly. "We're talking about organizing major construction projects to solve a problem that's only a problem because people didn't prepare adequately. The Voids ran out of supplies because Helmut got hurt and couldn't work. That's unfortunate, but it's not the community's responsibility to fix their poor planning." "Helmut's injury wasn't poor planning," Greta Voigt said sharply. "It was an accident." "Accident happened. That's why you build buffers into your supplies. That's why you save resources for emergencies instead of spending them." "We did save resources," Helmut said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We did plan. But planning has limits when winter comes early and cold snaps exceed anything in living memory, and your water system fails through no fault of your own. Then you deal with the consequences," John said. "You don't ask the rest of us to bail you out, because you couldn't handle conditions that we all faced." The room erupted, people shouting over each other, some agreeing with John's harsh individualism, others defending the families who were struggling, the conflict that had been simmering below the surface. The tension between self-sufficiency and mutual aid, between personal responsibility and community support, was breaking into open confrontation. Katrin watched it unfold and felt something shift inside her. She'd spent 2 years isolated, focused on her own survival, building her greenhouse as a private project that honored Magnus' memory. But the greenhouse wasn't private anymore. It had become public the moment she started sharing vegetables with families who needed them. It had become community property the moment people started depending on it. And communities didn't survive through isolation. They survived through cooperation, through sharing knowledge and resources, through recognizing that everyone's survival depended on everyone else's competence. She picked up Magnus' journal and held it above her head until the room quieted. "This journal isn't just engineering diagrams," she said. "It's also observations about this valley, about weather patterns and soil conditions and the resources available here. Magnus spent 20 years learning this place, documenting what worked and what didn't. He knew that survival up here required more than just individual effort. It required understanding systems, not just mechanical systems like greenhouses, but human systems, community systems." She looked directly at John Pritchard. "You're right, that people need to prepare adequately. But adequate preparation isn't possible when you're working with incomplete information, when you don't know that greenhouses can work in the Yukon because nobody's shared that knowledge, when you're relying on traditional methods that are inadequate for conditions that exceed historical norms. So your solution is to make everyone dependent on your greenhouse?" John challenged. "My solution is to make everyone capable of building their own, to share what Magnus learned so that next winter we have 10 greenhouses instead of 1, 20 families with fresh food instead of 2, a community that's resilient because our survival doesn't depend on any single person or system." She set the journal on the table. "I'm making copies of these drawings. Anyone who wants them can have them. Anyone who wants to learn can work with me this summer. Anyone who wants to build their own greenhouse gets access to everything I know, for free, because that's what Magnus would have done if he'd lived long enough to finish what he started." The room was silent. Then Helmut Voigt stood. "I'll work with you," he said. "I've got carpentry skills. I can help with construction." Anna Hendrickson stood. "I'll help with the gardening. I know plants. I can figure out what grows best in these conditions." One by one, people stood. 15 families committing to the project. Not everyone. John Pritchard remained seated, along with a few others who shared his philosophy. But enough. More than enough to build the greenhouses they needed. Sarah came to stand beside Katrin. "Magnus will be proud," she said quietly. "Magnus will be relieved," Katrin corrected. "He always worried that the knowledge would die with him, that he'd learn All these things, and they'd be lost when he was gone. Now they won't be. Section 8. The victory resolution achieved. The supply truck arrived from Whitehorse in late April, grinding up the road that was more mud than gravel now that the thaw had begun. It brought the usual supplies: fuel, flour, sugar, coffee, the staples that sustained life in the North. But it also brought something unexpected. A reporter from the Whitehorse Star, the territory's main newspaper. The reporter's name was James Mitchell, and he'd heard rumors about a community that had survived the coldest winter on record through innovative greenhouse agriculture. He wanted to document it, interview the people involved, photograph the structures, tell a story about resilience and cooperation in the face of extreme conditions. Katrin was reluctant. She didn't want attention. Didn't want strangers asking questions about Magnus or grief or the private reasons she'd built what she'd built. But Sarah convinced her that the story mattered, that other communities throughout the Yukon and beyond could benefit from knowing what was possible, that Magnus' legacy deserved to be larger than just Whitestone. So Katrin showed James the greenhouse, walked him through the systems, explained the engineering in terms he could translate for readers who'd never experienced minus 92 degrees and couldn't imagine conditions where fresh lettuce in February was revolutionary. James took photographs. The greenhouse interior with its thriving plants, the water barrels painted black for solar absorption, the compost bins generating steam even in spring when the outside temperature was above freezing. Katrin standing in front of the structure, her weathered face and strong hands testament to the labor that had made this possible. What made you think this would work? James asked. I didn't, Katrin admitted. I just knew I had to try. Magnus had done the planning. I did the building. Whether it worked or not almost didn't matter. The project kept me alive after he died, gave me purpose when I didn't have any other reason to keep going. And now it's keeping other people alive, which is bigger than me, bigger than Magnus, bigger than the grief that started all of this. The article ran in the Whitehorse Star 3 weeks later, spread across 2 full pages with photographs and detailed diagrams that James had commissioned based on Magnus drawings. The headline read, Widows Underground Greenhouse Feeds Yukon Community Through Coldest Winter on Record. The response was immediate. Letters from communities throughout the Yukon asking for copies of the designs. Requests from agricultural extension offices in Alaska and northern Canada wanting to study the systems. A grant offer from the territorial government to fund greenhouse construction in remote communities where fresh food access was limited. Katrin found herself at the center of attention she'd never wanted, fielding questions from people who saw her as an expert when she still thought herself as someone who'd just been, following her dead husband's instructions. But Sarah was right. The attention mattered. Within a year, 15 communities throughout the Yukon had built underground greenhouses based on Magnus designs. Within 3 years, the number had grown to 47. The systems were being refined, improved, adapted to local conditions. Engineers were studying the thermodynamics and publishing papers about geothermal agriculture in extreme cold climates. Magnus Norwegian engineers' knowledge, filtered through Magnus experience, implemented by Katrin's labor, had become a movement. Section 9, The New Life, Epilogue and Future. 2 years after the coldest winter on record, Whitestone had 7 functioning greenhouses producing food year-round for the entire community. Katrin stood in greenhouse number 3, the void structure built with community labor during the summer following the crisis, and watched Greta harvest spinach. The plants were healthy, thriving in a controlled environment that maintained temperature and light conditions optimal for growth. Helmut had added innovations to the original design. Automated ventilation systems that adjusted airflow based on interior temperature, a more efficient water barrel arrangement that maximized thermal storage, LED grow lights powered by solar panels that supplemented natural light during the darkest months. This wouldn't exist without you, Greta said, adding spinach to her harvest basket. It wouldn't exist without Magnus, Katrin corrected. I just built what he designed. You did more than that. You shared it, made it possible for the rest of us. Katrin thought about that, about the difference between building something for yourself and building something for a community, about how grief had driven her into isolation, but necessity had pulled her back out. about how Magnus' legacy had grown beyond what either of them could have imagined. The scurvy cases in Whitestone had disappeared. The nutritional deficiencies that had plagued the community every winter were gone, replaced by year-round access to fresh vegetables that provided vitamins and minerals previously unavailable. Children were healthier. Adults had more energy. The community had transformed from barely surviving winter to actually thriving through it. And it wasn't just Whitestone. Reports were coming in from other communities. Fewer scurvy cases, better nutrition, improved quality of life during the long, dark months. The greenhouses were changing how people lived in the North, proving that extreme conditions didn't have to mean extreme deprivation. Katrin walked back to her own homestead as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed impossible after the gray darkness of winter. Her greenhouse was still producing. She maintained it carefully, continuing to experiment with different crops and techniques, documenting what worked so that knowledge could be shared. She'd expanded the structure twice now, doubling its size, adding a second level of growing beds, installing more sophisticated climate control systems funded partly by the territorial grant and partly by income from the vegetables she now sold commercially to restaurants in Whitehorse that advertised locally grown winter greens from the Yukon. The income meant she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was stable, secure, had resources to invest in further improvements and experiments, had become, against all expectations, a successful farmer in a place where farming was supposedly impossible. Inside her cabin, she opened Magnus' journal to a page she'd read 1,000 times. His handwriting, familiar as her own thoughts, describing the greenhouse systems with the careful detail of someone who knew that knowledge had to be preserved to be useful. "You were right," she said aloud to the empty room, to Magnus' memory, to the presence that still occupied the space between her thoughts. The engineering worked. The community built what you designed. Your ideas spread farther than you ever expected. Magnus didn't answer, because Magnus was dead. But Katrin could feel his satisfaction anyway, could imagine him smiling at the knowledge that his years of observation and planning and careful documentation had mattered, had saved lives, had changed how people survived in the North. She closed the journal and set it on the shelf next to the new notebooks she'd been filling with her own observations, her own refinements to the systems, her own knowledge that would eventually be shared with whoever needed it next. The work wasn't finished, would never be finished. There were always more techniques to test, more crops to try, more communities that needed help building their own food security systems. But the foundation was solid. Magnus had laid it. Katrin had built on it. And now others were building further, creating a structure of shared knowledge that would outlast any individual life. Outside, the northern lights began to dance across the sky. Green curtains of light that moved like something alive, like the earth itself was celebrating survival through another winter, another crisis, another test that had seemed impossible until it wasn't. Katrin stood at her window and watched the lights, feeling something she hadn't felt since before Magnus died. Contentment. Not happiness, exactly. Grief didn't disappear just because life improved, but a sense of rightness, of being where she was supposed to be, doing what she was supposed to do, contributing to something larger than her own survival. The greenhouse had saved her, had given her purpose when grief threatened to destroy her, had taught her that isolation was sustainable for a while, but ultimately insufficient, that survival required community, that knowledge was only valuable when shared. Magnus had understood that. He documented everything carefully because he knew his ideas would outlive him if they were preserved properly. He'd trusted that someone, Katrin, as it turned out, would pick up his work and carry it forward. And she had carried it as far as she could alone, then had finally accepted help, had shared what she'd learned, had watched with amazement as Magnus engineering spread throughout the territory and beyond, transforming from one woman's grief project into a movement that was changing lives throughout the North. The lights continued their dance, green and purple and white, the aurora that had been there when Magnus was alive and would be there long after Katrin was gone. Constant presence, witness to all the small human struggles that took place beneath its glow. Katrin returned to the table, opened her current notebook, and began writing, documenting the day's observations, recording plant growth rates and system performance, and the questions that would guide tomorrow's experiments. The work continued, would always continue. One day at a time, one harvest at a time, one shared piece of knowledge at a time. Building something that would last, something that mattered, something that proved that even in the coldest, darkest, most hostile conditions imaginable, life found a way to persist if you created the right conditions for it to persist. If you paid attention, if you shared what you learned, if you understood that survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about thriving together, building systems that supported everyone rather than just yourself. Magnus had known that. Now Katrin knew it too. And because they both knew it, because they documented it carefully and shared it freely, communities throughout the North would continue to know it for generations to come. The knowledge would persist. The greenhouses would grow. And winter, for all its killing cold, would no longer mean slow starvation and nutritional deficiency and the grinding desperation of barely surviving until spring. Winter would mean fresh lettuce in February, spinach in January, kale that grew sweeter after frost, food that sustained life even when the temperature dropped to 90 degrees below zero and the world outside seemed determined to kill everything that lived. Defiance grown underground, resilience cultivated in darkness, hope harvested year-round. That was Magnus' legacy. That was Katrin's gift to the community. That was what survived when the cold finally broke and spring returned and the long, dark months became memory again. Life, growing where it shouldn't, persisting against impossible odds, proving that impossible was just another word for difficult. And difficult was something humans had always known how to overcome. One shovelful of earth at a time, one system at a time, one shared piece of knowledge at a time. Together. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.